Hello, welcome everybody to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Will Hopkins, the Executive Director of New Hampshire Peace Action. Just coming in, this is my first program after a 3-month sabbatical, so you've been hosted by Amy. In case you're new to New Hampshire Peace Action, we educate, mobilize, and organize to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. So the corona pandemic spurred us to start this biweekly conversation series well over 2 years ago now. As a way to continue our public education work. And we found it so effective that even if we get back to doing in-person program on a more regular basis, we've decided to continue it. This conversation series is intended to help us engage and sort out how to make the changes we've been yearning for. In that spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they have been stewarding throughout the generations. So tonight, we're being joined by a good friend and the director of an organization that we are organizational members of, the Granite State Organizing Project, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, grassroots organizing group in New Hampshire. And Sarah's going to talk to us, Sarah Jane's going to talk to us a little bit about what the cost of Pentagon spending is to our communities at the local level. Bit on Zoom etiquette, we're happy to have you keep your video on so we can see your face. You don't have to, but we'd love that. But we do ask that you keep your audio muted if you're not speaking. The chat is a great place to share reflections and ask questions. You're welcome when we do get to Q&A to either put an asterisk in the chat and I'll recognize you, or raise your hand on the screen. I might see you, but I don't see all the faces. Or you can type your question in the chat and I will ask it to Sarah Jane. So I don't want to keep talking too long. So without further ado, Sarah Jane, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Will. And it's great to see so many familiar faces here and so many new faces. And I'm so grateful to be asked to talk about this question. Although what I did say initially to Doreen and Will is you probably know more about Pentagon spending than I do. But I do know a lot about local issues and local problems that need money to be spent on them. So I think we can start there. As Will said, the Granite State Organizing Project is a grassroots community organization and a faith-based organization. Our members include faith and values-based. Our members include a lot of faith communities around the state, as well as values-based organizations like the American Friends or Peace Action, a few labor unions, and some public housing residents and tenants and individual members as well. We've been working for the past several years on a lot of local issues, but in particular, we focused on housing and education. And so that's where I went when I was asked to think about this question of how Pentagon spending adversely affects local spending on important issues. So I think I would like to start with housing. And I think that we have a slide that shows how the housing budget in this country has been cut over the past many years. And we'll take a look at this. So this is just from fiscal year 2010 to 2020. And it shows that most of the housing programs, HUD is the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. Most of the housing programs have been cut dramatically over the past 10 years. And just in case you're not familiar with some of these terms, this is from the Low Income Housing Coalition. But I want you to know that CDBG is Community Development Block Grant funding. That's funding that goes to cities and towns to be spent on things like infrastructure that can support housing, and sometimes on building a little bit of housing. The HOME program is a program that the federal government created that supports investment in home ownership primarily, but a little bit of rental housing. And it supports mostly private developers to develop housing. The housing for the elderly, that's pretty obvious. Housing for persons with disabilities, got a big cut. What you might not be so familiar with, well, first of all, if you look at Public Housing Capital Fund, that's the black box that hardly exists, that has been cut, even though it hardly exists. And then tenant-based rental assistance is Section 8 vouchers, and project-based rental assistance is buildings that are all Section 8, but are owned by private developers. So why is this important? This is important because, and then you can take this screen down so we can see each other, I think. This is important because New Hampshire has currently needs 24,423 rental homes. We are short 24,423 rental homes. Now, that's not low income housing, that's not affordable housing, that is just how many rental units we're short. And we're short close to 10,000 purchase homes. So what that means is that there are people who are living doubled and tripled up. There are people who want to move out of one apartment, a small apartment, to a bigger apartment or a bigger home because their family's grown and they can't because that housing doesn't exist. So then if we look at the next slide, it shows how much housing is of the gross domestic product. So you'd think housing is important, right? Everybody needs a house, everyone needs a place to live. And this money that I'm talking about, to be very clear, supports private housing as well as what you might think of as public housing. This is the HUD budget. So it has gone down dramatically since 1978. And the amount the federal government now spends on housing is, that looks like 0.23% of the gross domestic product, right? So you can hold on to that. And we will talk later about what percent military spending is of the gross domestic product, which can help you get an idea of where our nation's priorities are. So then if we look at the slide that has the numbers about the area median income, which hopefully is the next one. Oh, no, but here, that's another example. There we go. So what does this mean? So when you saw that chart, the little tiny amount of money that went to public housing is where I want to focus for a minute, because the nation has gone through a systemic disinvestment in public housing for the past 50 years. And public housing is the only housing that is appropriate for people who make, my example is 30% of the area median income, but actually it's the only housing that's appropriate for people that make 50% of the area median income or less. So the area median income for New Hampshire, the New Hampshire household median income. Anybody want to put a guess in the chat what the household median income is in New Hampshire? No, it's $77,923 is the New Hampshire median household income. So people who make 30% of the New Hampshire area median income must have public housing, which means housing that's owned by the government to live in, or they will not be able to afford to live anywhere. Why? Look at these numbers. If you make 30% of the New Hampshire area median income and you are a single person, you make $18,000 a year, which is slightly over our minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. That means you make $1,566 a month. We're all supposed to spend 1/3 of our income on housing costs. So that means you can afford an apartment that's $522 a month. And you can see on down to a family of 4, $26,800 a year. That means $22,233 a month before taxes. That means you can afford an apartment that's $670 a month. So what that means is that you can't afford to live in any housing other than housing that's owned by the government. Now, why is that? You might say, well, what about Section 8 vouchers? They can use Section 8 vouchers. Well, actually, they can't. They could get them, but it's not going to help because Section 8 vouchers, which is a voucher that a private landlord can accept, which means that you pay only 1/3 of your income towards rent. Vouchers don't cover your utilities at all unless any of the utilities are included in the rent. So if you had a family of 4 and you had a voucher that would allow you to rent a 2-bedroom apartment and you found one that you could afford with your voucher was $670 a month, which means that it was close to $2,000 a month rent, but the Section 8 voucher would pay the remainder. You would still have to pay your electricity and your heat and your internet and your telephone. Even if your heat or electricity was included, you'd still have to pay those other utilities. So you can take that screen away now if people have enough comfort with those numbers. So this is why when we talk about housing, I like to think about public housing first, because a lot of people think that public housing was a failure and that it's great that we tore down all the public housing. And that's actually not 100% true. Public housing was owned by the government. It's public housing. All these new programs, tax credit programs, home programs, Section 8 vouchers, give the money to private developers and private investors. So it is a privatization of what should be a public good. Because, as I said, people who make that low of an income simply cannot afford to find housing on the open market. I did a quick Google search this afternoon for apartments in New Hampshire for under $500 a month. And so the response came up, oh, here, go to this page. There's 600 responses. And then I got to that page and it said, there are no apartments that meet your search criteria, but here's some for $2,000. Here's some for $4,000. So it's really, really true that we need to invest in housing if we want to keep our nation healthy. And I think if you have been following the stories about the problems with how so-called homeless people without homes in Manchester, Nashua, Keene, Rochester, you can see that those problems would be much, much less if we invested as a nation in a meaningful way in the kind of public housing that would keep people off of the streets, because most of the people that are living on the streets do have an income, which is probably SSDI or Social Security. So that means their income is probably $800 a month. So you see where the mismatch is. Are there any special questions about housing before I transition to schools? Because I want to talk about schools, because what we're going to see is that what the government did in terms of disinvesting in housing is now what they're trying to do in terms of disinvesting in schools. And we're going to see where that money goes. Do you want to let Mike ask his question, Will?
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, so my understanding is each city had housing authorities or something like that, that it wasn't necessarily a statewide or, so how would that work in New Hampshire? Would different cities be responsible for dealing with the housing issue?
That's a great question. The public housing authorities are so-called public-private partnerships. And so in Manchester and Nashua, there are boards. Keene, there's a board of the public housing entity. It might be called the Nashua Housing and or Manchester Housing and Development, Nashua Housing and Organization. They are not run by the cities per se, but they have boards. All their funding is from HUD through National HUD. And so so for example, in Manchester, the Manchester Housing and Redevelopment Authority operates Elmwood Gardens, they operate Rimmon Heights. In Nashua, the Nashua Housing and Redevelopment Authority operates Major Drive Housing. They operate several senior buildings. They recently operated the Bronstein building. So it's different in every city, but it's a similar structure. And that's just publicly funded housing. So I recently learned through some work with an organization we're working with in Keene that most people who haven't experienced this housing issue firsthand actually believe that all poor people live in public housing, and that there is public housing available for all poor people, or Section 8 vouchers available for all poor people. So I want to make sure that you know that the waiting list for a Section 8 voucher is years long in New Hampshire. In some towns it's 5 years, some towns it's 6 years, some towns it's 2 years. And many people who get a voucher can't use it because you have to use it within 3 to 6 months or you must give it back. And they can't find a landlord who will take it. So they end up giving it back. We would like very much to pass a law in New Hampshire that prohibits discrimination against Section 8 as a method of payment. Many other states have it. I believe all other states in New England have it. We've tried to pass it here and it's always failed, but that would go a long way towards helping with some of the problem. It wouldn't help with the problem of 24,000 apartments needed, but it would help with the problem with Section 8. The waiting list to get into public housing is just as long as the waiting list to get a Section 8 voucher. So that means that the vast majority of low-income people are out in the public market trying to rent affordable housing, which is just market rate affordable, which you might think of as poor quality housing, because that's what it generally is. And they're competing with people who have more money and more resources for each apartment. So is that clear? And thank you, Mike, for that question. I think that clarifies things a bit.
The only other thing I heard, I don't know if this is true, is that a lot of public housing, the actual units are catered for seniors.
There are quite a few for seniors. There's both family and senior housing. So for example, here in Manchester, in addition to running the Elmwood and Rock Rimmon family projects, they also run the Gallon building and several senior projects. And as you saw from that chart, the funding for senior housing is more popular than the funding for family housing, because we tend, as a society, not to blame seniors for being poor, but we tend to blame low-income families and moms with children for being poor. So our values really affect our funding. I think maybe we could now talk about what's happened with housing is that all across the board, all the important housing programs have been systematically defunded over the past 50 years. And it was planned in part by the private housing development industry. To be very clear, both Republican and Democrat presidents have participated in these cuts. Obama signed some cuts that cut housing $6 billion, cut CDBG 12%. So it's not just Republicans. However, under Donald Trump, the housing spending fell to about the lowest it's ever been. It fell to about $47.9 billion. During COVID, we had a big spike and it went up to almost $90 billion because of all the extra funding that came during COVID. And Biden's current proposal for 2023 is 71.9 billion. So that's good, but it's not enough. The Center for Policy and Budget Analysis suggests that we need a $70 billion investment just in the public housing infrastructure in this country, just in repairing the public housing that's falling down and building the public housing that's needed. So now we'll go to what do they have planned? Oh, one last slide, Will, sorry, number 5. It just tells you quickly who public housing actually serves. And you can see it's mostly female heads of household, a lot of young families with children, with the head of the household being 25 to 50, majority people of color, and a fair number of people with disabilities. So you can see again how our values as a nation impact the decisions we make about this funding. So then let's go to schools. So let's start with that really cool graphic from the New Hampshire School Funding Project. This shows you by size of green dot how much each town in New Hampshire spends per student. And I don't know if you can see it, it's a little small, but what struck me, of course, is that Manchester, New Hampshire, which is the largest city in the state and one of the most diverse, spends $12,201 per student in elementary school. Waterville Valley spends $57,058 per student in elementary school. Now, who owns property in Waterville Valley? Some kind of a ski resort?
Be the Sununu
Would it
family.
be the Sununu family?
Yeah, I think it would be. I think it would be. And interestingly enough, because we all know that the school funding in New Hampshire is based on property taxes and so on. Interestingly enough, the median household income in Manchester is $62,000, and the median household income in Waterville Valley is $76,750. So it's not that much higher, right? It's higher, but it's not as much higher as the differences between how much they spend on schools. And the thing that really bugs me about this is we as a society, the teachers, the school board, the city council, the State Board of Education, Frank Edelblue, we blame the parents and the children and the culture of the families for the failure of the children in Manchester, Nashua, Rochester, Claremont, the places where the spending is abysmally low. So if anybody wants to see their town, shout it out. I'm sure Will can roll over that town and we'll put it in the chat so you can look it up.
Can I see Barrington?
You can enter it into this white bar and you can find a town there.
There's a white bar. Oh, up
Yeah,
here.
right there.
Great.
Yeah.
It's like Barrington.
Just if you can scroll down or enter it, yeah.
Oops.
Question, how is the extra money being spent? I mean, in a district that they spend 1.5 times as much, the teachers would not necessarily be getting 1.5 times as much. So
Yeah.
is it, how does it go to administrators' salary, new buildings? How does the money actually get spent?
A lot of it, I mean, some of it is pay, but a lot of it is enhancements like art programs, computers on every desk, music programs, all the kinds of things that the kids in the bigger cities and the lower income cities haven't seen for over a decade. So anyway, we put that in the chat so that you can look at it later and play with it. It's just fascinating. And the New Hampshire School Funding Project is a great organization to get involved with if education is your thing. So what I want to talk about is, so I say that they're trying to do, whoever the they is trying to do the same thing to schooling, to education that they did to housing. Well, as you know, New Hampshire has passed a law that allows education freedom fund accounts, right? And so under this law, a family can say that they don't want to send their children to public school and apply to the state to access funds that will be taken out of the public school budget and sent to the private school. And people can apply for this help who make all the way up to 300% of the federal poverty level. So a family of four that makes $79,500 can apply for this and get a school funding grant for their child. So I am not against religious schools. I'm not against private schools, but I am against taking more money out of our public schools. And then what I found out is that so far in New Hampshire, and this was a few months ago, $2.4 million has been spent out of this fund and allocated to families. And families can apply for that money either to pay tuition or to buy their kids supplies that they need for education. So guess who got most of that state money? Got 18.2% of that state money, the largest vendor that got that state money. They got $437,736. Amazon. Amazon. Yeah. The second largest was religious schools, Trinity Christian School in Concord, Laconia Christian Academy, Mount Royal Academy. Fine. The ninth spot, 50,000, went to Staples. So this money that could be spent in our public schools is getting spent at private schools and private for-profit businesses. So the way that I don't want to get into the whole way that this program was set up. I think you've all seen some of the articles about how at first Sununu said not that many families would take advantage of it, and then a lot more did than they thought, and it's actually ending up costing a lot more. There's a great coverage on it about it on public radio. So I think, and this is happening all across the country. So I think what we're going to see in our lifetime is that there's going to be a massive shift, just as there was in housing spending, away from spending on government-run entities to being spent on private schools and private for-profit companies that sell education and education material. So as I said, you all know way more about the military budget than I do, but I did make one last slide, Will, about the military budget just for the past few years. So you can see that for housing, we're talking about numbers like 70 billion. And for the defense budget, we're talking numbers that I can't even say, right? In terms of how big they are. And the military budget, according to my research, is currently 3.74% of the gross domestic product. That seems low to me, but that's what I came up with. But remember that housing, which is something that we all need and we are in a terrible crisis, is only 0.23% of the gross domestic product. So then I do want to take just one more minute and talk about this foreign aid category of the military budget and how that affects us here in New Hampshire. So you can take the screen down if you don't mind. We can always share all this with people later. So just as an example, and again, Arnie is a total expert on this, so I don't want to embarrass myself, but just as an example, in 1954, the United States government gave Eisenhower gave the military a $2.7 million budget to take down the democratically elected president in Guatemala. That was successful. In the end, they spent close to $7 million doing it. We unseated Jacobo Arbenez because we thought he was soft on communism, and we installed a military dictatorship, which resulted in 4 decades of civil war, the genocide of the Mayan people, and was done in part at the behest of the United Fruit Company, who didn't like the fact that the minimum wage had been increased under Arbenez. So how does that affect us here in New Hampshire? Well, we know people, Arnie and I know people who are in New Hampshire because of what those decades of civil war did to Guatemala. We know people who were forced to leave Guatemala when the gangs threatened to kill their child and sent a picture home of her in school and said, "You'll never see her again if you don't pay us off." That is an impact that goes right from the US government spending in foreign countries to here in New Hampshire, where this family is now living, and they're successful members of the local community, successful members of their local church, but experiencing severe trauma, and they are now a part of us. So that's kind of where I wanted to stop and see if we could have some discussion and some questions. And I can also get Will the link to the NHPR story about that documents the spending of the education freedom accounts. It was on April 6th this year, but I'll get you the actual link to it later so you can have all this information. So I'm not trying to be discouraging. It's a lot of discouraging facts, but that's why we exist, right? We exist to push back. We exist to fight about what our priorities are as a nation, and we exist to lobby for what our public spending priorities should be, and we can make a difference.
All right. Oh, so as we jump into Q&A, I want to open with LR's question. And LR, I'm going to call you out a little bit because some of the websites we put in, was there a specific set of figures you wanted to be able to find?
Yes, I think it was what Sarah Jane just referred to, which was the spending for the freedom vouchers and who was getting that money. I just wondered where I could find a citing for that. And I think Sarah Jane, you just said get it to us.
Yeah, and I just put in the chat, it was NHPR on April 2nd, 2000. I mean, April 6th, sorry. That was typo, April 6th, and I'll get the actual link. Yeah.
Thanks. All right. Well, because Mike already asked a question, and usually I'd go with other people, but nobody else has raised their hand yet. So Mike, go ahead.
Hey, Will, great to have you back, first of all. And second, I saw a documentary not too long ago talking about Guatemala. So it was by John Chancellor, I think, who ended up becoming the anchor of, I think it's NBC News in 1970. But the interview is in 1965, and he's interviewing Alan Dulles on his years in the CIA overthrowing governments. And a big part of the interview is talking about Guatemala. And so at one point in the interview, they go and interview the guy that's leading the resistance in Guatemala in 1965. And they said to him, well, why are you fighting the US government? Why are you blowing up, the foreign aid workers' vehicles and stuff like that? And he says, well, you don't understand what they're doing to us. We're only fighting back because our life is being destroyed. And it's, I don't know how long it is, 45 minutes to an hour, something like that. It's not too long, but it interviews another guy that was involved in overthrowing governments, Richard Bissell, who had taken over after the original guy. And these men are just speaking matter of factly, yeah, we're America, that's what we do. And I just scratched my head. It's like, wow, in 1965, they were that open about how America just goes around the world and breaks people's stuff, right? And so the thing about Guatemala that's in my mind kind of fascinating is it started in 51 when they were trying to get rid of Yocobar Benz. Under Truman, there was actually something, but it failed. And so the CIA, they're one of those organizations that just has so damn much money that they keep doing it till they achieve their purpose. So that's kind of similar to the one in Iran too, is it made it on the second try. The coups don't always achieve what they want at first, but they have so much money, they just keep going till they topple the government.
So
I'm sorry, I should have asked a question. I just got excited about what you were talking about. I apologize for not asking a question.
It's all right. Sometimes it takes a minute to get warmed up. So
Well,
I noted what does the 80,000 or was it? Or, I'm sorry, 80 billion or 70 billion you named. Is that a target that would eliminate homelessness or just get all the Section 8 vouchers? What was that? What does that number target?
Thanks. The 70 billion is from the Center for Law, Budget and Policy that says that the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, 70 billion would be enough to create and support the public housing that we need. So if you remember the graph, the money for just maintaining public housing has been cut dramatically. And that's part of a way to make it look like public housing is failing, is you cut the money for infrastructure repair, for maintenance and so on, and then it starts to fall apart. So that 70 billion is really just to fix what we have and build what we need to replace. But I think that would go a long way toward eliminating homelessness, because most of the people who end up homeless are those very, very low income people that need that kind of support. Another sort of casualty of the war on drugs was that any family that has any arrest, even for marijuana, often this would happen after an arrest, not a conviction, has to be evicted from public housing. So that meant that, if you're a mom and your 13-year-old son was caught with a little marijuana, you would get evicted from your home. And so that's a policy change that we're recommending that nationally needs to happen. There needs to be a little bit of lenience on that kind of thing. I see 2 hands up.
Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
yes, I think to follow up with what Michael was saying, it's important to remember that the fierce gang issues that we have in some of the cities, some of that was imported from El Salvador. And it came from El Salvador by Salvadorans who had sought refuge in the United States and were especially I think in Los Angeles, got involved in the gang culture there and then got deported back to El Salvador. So some of that turmoil that is now pressuring a lot of people to try to flee El Salvador and other countries, was originated in this country.
Was there another hand that you saw, Sarah Jane? I don't see any more. Got a thumbs up from LR.
Okay. From Susie Krautman.
Oh,
Yeah,
Susie. Susie, go ahead.
Susie.
Well, it's Paul,
Hey, Paul.
whatever. Now, I think it needs to be pointed out that this Edelbud character, who's the head of the education department in New Hampshire, one of his kids, I think maybe his oldest, is a student at Hillsdale College, which is at the forefront of putting away public education. Hillsdale College is all for homeschooling and all for charter schools, blah, blah, blah. And so Edelbud, even though he might go away tomorrow, he has a son who's going to be trained in the ditzing of public education in the United States of America for the dadgum next generation. So he's a dangerous character. His son will be a dangerous character, and I'm not using that term lightly. There are a lot of dangerous characters in this world. I think one of the biggest problems we have, and I get into a little bit of the politics, is the Democratic Party doesn't push back enough. And anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Thanks, Sarah Jane, for being here.
Sarah Jane, if you have any response, go for it. Otherwise, LR, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, let's go with LR.
Okay. I'm feeling particularly, you might think that my picture isn't showing tonight because I was hitting my head against the wall reading the news tonight, specifically the pieces around the money that we are spending to blow up an asteroid just in case we are in any danger of being blown up ourselves. So this is the context of that, and this is hair-raising. But I wanted to ask you what you felt were the most effective means for applying public resistance to this budget in New Hampshire.
Thank you. That's always a tough one. Unfortunately or fortunately, I think the most effective thing is actually all of us talking individually or in small groups or in medium-sized groups with our state reps, even when they are free staters, right-wing lunatics, whatever bad word you want me to use, because they will occasionally move when they hear a personal story from their district. They will not move if we protest, and I love to protest. They don't care when we stand out in front of the Capitol and pass out flyers about housing or education. They really don't care. But if we can talk to them one-on-one, tell them stories from our own community, our own families, talk to them in small groups, that's one thing. And the other thing is that we have to elect new people. We really have to elect people that will make their priorities humanity. Housing and education are the two areas I picked because they're basic to a healthy functioning society. In a healthy functioning society, you need people to be literate. You need them to have a shared understanding of what the world is, at least a minimal shared understanding, and you need them to have a roof over their head. And so we need to make that our priority when we elect people. And I hope that's not too political for the organization.
I think it speaks right to our mission.
And Will has his hand up now, I think.
Will,
the other
ahead.
Will.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear?
We can hear you, Will.
Okay, good. Well, I hate to be a Debbie Downer here, okay, or a Will Downer. But the fact is, stronger action is needed. Now, I know, by the way, I posted, I live in the same town as Jason Osborne, and I knew he had gone to Hillsdale. And I also know there's an academy, and I believe it's maybe Paul knows this, in Peterborough, funded by or started by Hillsdale as well. And as a retired teacher, of course, I'm very concerned about the privatization of public education, or as they call them, government schools. But the fact is, how do we overcome the fact that Americans in general, maybe a majority, don't have a problem with spending, let's say, $3 trillion on Afghanistan? A country, most countries in Europe are, quote, socialistic, where they have free education, universal health care. I hate to go on, but what's wrong with this country? And I hate to say that, but capitalism, and again, I'm, a democratic socialist. And how do we convince the Democrats as well as the Republicans that in the long run, what's best for not just our country, but the world, humanity? I mean, we got submarines floating out there in all the oceans that can obliterate all of humanity and the planet. I mean, existential besides global warming. So I'm concerned about, by the way, I'm running for the House, and one of my opponents is Jess Edwards, who's kind of a lieutenant for Osborne, who is the real Speaker of the House, I think. You would agree, Sarah, that Osborne is pulling the strings and not Packard, who's the Speaker of the House. But be that as it may, how do we move the general public from Z to what, L? How do we inform them that in the long run, we're killing ourselves, and we're not seeking the common good? And Arnie had a great letter, which Arnie, I think you're still on. I posted, I think, most of it on the Auburn political page. And of course, some of the Free Staters there, libertarians, etc., took umbrage at my posting that letter about, working for the common good, as what we all are, I think, doing. So that's my commentary, and thank you.
Well, that's one of those questions, but I think it really comes down to, where do you stand and where is your heart? And we have to believe in the intrinsic goodness of every human being and find a way to reach that goodness. As we do the political and the policy work. I think that's my answer to the unanswerable question.
Well, I agree. Thank you for that.
Something that happened in the chat that I think we should share for everybody in case they're not following the chat or folks watching the video after. So Doreen asks, I know this isn't related to military spending, but what happened to the 100 million American Rescue Plan funds for affordable housing? And you typed a response, Sarah Jane, but if you don't mind responding verbally a little bit, just so that we can hear a little bit about what happened to that money.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the part that the governor was going to spend here in New Hampshire, I think most of it is going to different towns and development entities, and they are submitting housing projects, not a project like public housing, but housing plans and projects they want to do. I think some amount of it was going to be set aside for demolition, which I'm not sure I agree with. It was going to be demolition supposedly of housing that or other properties that then would make way for more affordable housing. It's not clear that it's all going to be affordable. I'm kind of neutral on it. It was the way for the governor to sound like he was doing something, but it really wasn't anything he did. It was federal money. And again, I think New Hampshire Housing on their website would have more detailed information.
All right. So there's another question from Mike. Mike, go ahead.
Yeah, so if I've read my history right, there was a big concern at the beginning of the 70s when people were in the streets marching to stop the war, to stop all the kinds of things that were going on. And men behind the scenes including a man that became Justice Powell, got very concerned, and they said, okay, we need to come up with a strategy to put a kibosh on this excess democracy, I think they called it. And so they came up with a strategy called defund the left in the 80s. I think it was in the early 80s when I first heard about it. And it seems like the men that don't like the kind of things that you advocate and that I agree with. I mean, I love public everything. I'm a very public person in that sense. They are dedicated, it seems like, to winning no matter who gets hurt or killed or and so my question is, what is the advantage of studying the people? You know, there's a saying, you need to know your enemy if you're going to try to win. You can't just always hope for the best and be rosy and achieve as much. So my question is, how much effort have you put into understanding the people who oppose everything that you want to accomplish?
I think that's a good question for all the people on the call who do organizing and political work. But the Granite State Organizing Project is a part of a national organization called Faith in Action. And we have studied the Powell Memo. We have studied a lot of the history of this. And I think the main lesson I take away from it is that we have to be smart. We have to be as wise as a serpent and as gentle as a dove, if I can quote the Bible somehow or other. You know, we need to know that this didn't happen by accident, and that the folks that ended up as the Tea Party were planning it for a long time. And we need to be just as smart or smarter. But I think Will or Arnie could also answer that question. So, yeah.
And I'll just jump in to say that I think that you know, every organization has strategy. You know, we think about strategy, we meet and you know, we have board retreats and talk about strategy, and always part of that is, you know, a spectrum of allies and opponents, and how do we move everybody a little closer to ally and a little further away from opponent? How do we you know, and it's always you know, who are we going to be messaging toward, and why is a question that we're always asking. So I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on that a little bit, but do you think anyone who's organizing has to be thinking about those questions? I mean, I know you do, Mike, as well, but all right. Well, shall we? Do you have any parting thoughts, Sarah Jane? I'm going to go into what our upcoming program is here in a moment in our outro. But do you have any parting thoughts you wanted to share before we do that?
Well, again, just thank you. It was really interesting conversation. I enjoyed thinking about these issues and putting all these different thoughts together. Thank you for your comments and your questions. And you know, it's doing things like this that will help us to develop the skills and the relationships that we need to win. And I'm just really grateful that the Granite State Organizing Project is now in a closer relationship with the New Hampshire Peace Action. And I look forward to continuing to work together. So really just thank you.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. It was really great getting to kind of bring local you know, we talk about Pentagon bloat and the you know, the reality that Pentagon spending, in particularly military contracting, is an economic driver in New Hampshire, and what that costs our communities, and bringing it to a local level is really valuable for us, and it's something we don't often do. So I deeply appreciate you coming tonight, Sarah Jane, and thank you everyone for joining us. 2 weeks from today, we'll have Judith LeBlanc. She was the national field organizer for Peace Action for several years, and she's done some other work since then. A lot of it around Native people's issues. And she's going to be talking to us about why it's important that we shift from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. So that's Monday, October 10th. That Friday, October 14th, we will have our fall fundraiser and annual event. It's going to be a panel including more than half of the staff that has worked for New Hampshire Peace Action ever. So we'll hear from a whole bunch of people who have worked with the organization starting in 1982 through to today. So that's October 14th. On the 24th, we'll host Lindsay Koshgarian, who's the Executive Director of the National Priorities Project, which, versus this, which really looked at locally what the cost of our excessive military spending is. She's going to zoom out and look at the full federal budget and talk about what the trade-offs are in federal funding. We're confirmed with Peter Kelman for November 21st. We're not sure who's going to be on November 7th yet, so stay tuned for that. But every other Monday we're here, so make sure you come join us. Let's just check the chat one last time. It looks good. So Sarah Jane, thank you so much, and good night, everyone.
Thank you.